The Soviet soldiers who first laid eyes on American prisoner of war camps in the spring of 1945 stood motionless at the chain-link fences, their gaunt faces frozen in expressions that guards would later describe as pure incomprehension. These were men who had endured 4 years of captivity under conditions that had stripped away every assumption about human civilization, every belief about how societies fed their people. What stopped them cold was not the absence of cruelty or the presence of kindness. It was something far more impossible to process. Fresh vegetables growing in organized rows behind the barracks. Orchards heavy with fruit. Livestock pens where chickens scratched in clean straw and dairy cows stood in proper shelters. The prisoners were staring at functioning farms, operated by and for captured enemy soldiers, producing food that would actually be given to those same prisoners to eat. For men who had spent years watching starvation claim their brothers one by one, who had learned that hunger was the permanent condition of captivity, who had been taught through daily suffering that captured soldiers existed only to die slowly, the sight of these agricultural operations seemed to violate the fundamental laws of warfare itself. They had survived German prison camps where a single potato was worth a man's life, where the mere thought of fresh food had become a torture more refined than any beating. Now they stood before evidence that some captors actually grew food specifically to feed their prisoners, not as a reward or a trick, but as standard operating procedure. The disbelief ran so deep that many refused to accept what their eyes were showing them. Some insisted the farms must be elaborate stage sets, theatrical props designed to deceive visiting inspectors. Others theorized that the food was being grown by prisoners as forced labor, only to be shipped away to feed American civilians or troops. The concept that enemy soldiers might be given the tools, the land, and the resources to grow their own sustenance, and then be permitted to eat what they produced, seemed to belong to a different universe than the one they had inhabited for the past 4 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The numbers themselves tell a story of 2 different worlds operating under the same war. Soviet prisoners liberated from German camps in 1945 weighed on average 30 to 40 kilograms less than their documented weight at the time of capture. Medical examinations revealed chronic malnutrition so severe that many would never fully recover, their bodies permanently damaged by years of deliberate starvation. Meanwhile, German and Italian prisoners held in American camps showed weight gain during captivity, their health improving rather than deteriorating behind the wire. The difference was not just in philosophy or international law. It was in the dirt itself, in the seeds planted and the harvests gathered, in the systematic approach to food production that separated slow death from sustained life. Soviet soldiers had entered German captivity with certain expectations about hunger. Every warrior knows that captured men face reduced rations, that food becomes scarce, that meals shrink to subsistence levels. What they could not have anticipated was the discovery that their captors had implemented starvation as official policy, a calculated tool of extermination dressed in the language of military necessity. The shock was not the presence of hunger, but the methodical nature of it, the way food deprivation had been engineered with the same precision that other armies applied to logistics and supply chains. The first days in German prison camps had revealed the shape of what was to come. Soviet prisoners arrived at collection points after brutal marches, already weakened by combat and the chaos of capture. They expected to receive reduced rations, perhaps a fraction of what soldiers in the field consumed, but something. Instead, they were herded into vast open-air compounds where no food appeared at all. Not reduced rations. Not bread crusts or watery soup. Nothing. The absence was so total that prisoners initially assumed there had been some administrative delay, that supplies were en route, that surely by evening or the next morning, food would arrive. Days passed with no sustenance beyond what men could scavenge from the ground itself. Prisoners dug for roots, stripped bark from any available trees, consumed grass and leaves that left them retching and sick but filled their stomachs with something, anything. The German guards watched this desperate foraging with indifference, making no move to distribute rations, offering no explanation for the absence of food. It slowly became clear that this was not a temporary situation or a logistical failure. This was the system. When food did eventually appear, it came in quantities that mocked the concept of sustenance. A single small potato shared among 5 men. A ladle of soup so thin it was essentially hot water with a few floating scraps. Bread rations of perhaps 100 grams per day, barely enough to keep a sedentary person alive, utterly inadequate for men forced into hard labor. Soviet prisoners quickly learned to perform gruesome calculations about survival. How long could a human body function on 200 calories per day? How many days could they work before collapsing? Which friends would die first? The contrast with how German forces fed their own troops created a cognitive dissonance that was almost impossible to process. Soviet prisoners assigned to work details near German military installations could smell cooking food, real meals being prepared in field kitchens. They watched German soldiers receive hot rations multiple times per day, saw supply trucks delivering fresh provisions, observed the casual abundance that characterized even frontline German logistics. The food existed. It was being transported, prepared, and consumed within sight of starving prisoners. It simply was not being shared. What made the hunger particularly maddening was the knowledge that Soviet prisoners had been captured alongside vast quantities of military supplies, including food stores. German forces had seized Soviet supply depots, warehouses full of grain, storage facilities packed with preserved foods. These captured provisions were inventoried, catalogued, and shipped back to Germany or distributed to German troops. The food that might have kept Soviet prisoners alive was instead consumed by the very forces that had decided to starve their captives. Soviet prisoners watched as German guards ate bread in front of them, sometimes deliberately, sometimes with casual indifference. The psychological torture of constant proximity to food that would never be shared created obsession that dominated every waking thought. Men dreamed of meals they had eaten in childhood, describing dishes in elaborate detail to fellow prisoners who listened with the intensity of starving men savoring imaginary feasts. These food fantasies became a form of mental escape, but also a refined cruelty, as the contrast between memory and reality grew more painful with each passing day. The few Soviet prisoners who possessed any agricultural knowledge found themselves in situations of profound irony. Men who had grown up on collective farms, who understood crop cultivation and animal husbandry, who could have helped produce food even in captivity, were forbidden from applying their skills. German authorities occasionally assigned Soviet prisoners to work on German farms, but only as manual laborers in existing operations. They were not permitted to plant gardens for their own use, not allowed to raise even small livestock, not given any means to supplement their starvation rations through their own efforts. Some prisoners attempted to secretly cultivate tiny plots in hidden corners of prison compounds, scratching shallow furrows in hard ground with their fingernails, planting seeds scavenged from their meager rations. These desperate agricultural efforts were discovered and destroyed by guards who viewed them as security violations rather than survival attempts. The message was unmistakable. Soviet prisoners would not be allowed to feed themselves. Their hunger was not an unfortunate side effect of limited resources. It was deliberate policy. The seasonal cycles of agricultural abundance visible in the German countryside added layers of psychological torment. Soviet prisoners held in rural camps could see German farmers harvesting crops in surrounding fields, watch wagons loaded with vegetables pass by the prison wire, observe the autumn plenty that characterized European agriculture even during wartime. The disconnect between visible food production and their own starvation created a surreal quality to their suffering. They were dying of hunger in the midst of agricultural regions producing food surpluses. Winter brought new dimensions to the food crisis. The already inadequate rations shrank further as German authorities diverted resources to their own population facing increasing hardship. Soviet prisoners found themselves receiving even less than the starvation level allotments of previous months. Men who had survived summer on willpower and scavenged grass now faced freezing temperatures with bodies already depleted of all reserves. The combination of extreme cold and near-total absence of calories created a death spiral that claimed thousands of lives each week. Soviet medical personnel captured alongside regular troops found themselves unable to address the fundamental cause of their patients' decline. They could diagnose malnutrition, identify vitamin deficiencies, recognize the symptoms of starvation-related diseases. But they had no ability to provide the only treatment that mattered, which was food. They watched men die from conditions that proper nutrition would have prevented or cured, their medical knowledge rendered useless by the deliberate withholding of sustenance. The psychological adaptation required to survive chronic starvation fundamentally changed how Soviet prisoners thought about food, agriculture, and the basic functioning of human societies. They had entered captivity assuming that all civilizations maintained some minimal standard of feeding even their enemies, that the impulse to provide sustenance was universal, that even the cruelest captor would recognize the need to keep prisoners barely alive. These assumptions crumbled as months of systematic starvation taught them that food provision was a choice, not an obligation, and that their captors had chosen to let them starve. The few instances when Soviet prisoners did receive slightly larger rations only reinforced how arbitrary their deprivation had been. Occasionally, German authorities would provide marginally better food when prisoners were needed for particularly demanding labor projects, demonstrating that adequate supplies existed and could be distributed when German interests demanded it. These temporary improvements in rations made the return to starvation even more agonizing, as prisoners now knew with certainty that their hunger was not inevitable but chosen. Soviet prisoners began to develop a fatalistic acceptance that they were meant to die slowly from hunger, that this was the intended outcome of their captivity rather than an unfortunate consequence of wartime scarcity. They watched their bodies consume themselves, muscle tissue breaking down to fuel basic biological functions, organs beginning to fail as malnutrition progressed from acute to chronic to terminal. The mirror of starvation showed them transformations they could barely recognize, skeletal figures that bore little resemblance to the soldiers they had been. The knowledge that adequate food existed just beyond their reach, that agricultural production continued all around them, that their starvation was a policy choice rather than a resource constraint, created a bitterness that would outlast the war itself. Soviet prisoners learned lessons about human nature that no propaganda could have taught them, understanding in the most visceral way possible that food security was not a given, that agricultural abundance did not guarantee sustenance for all, that some societies chose to feed their enemies while others chose to starve them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the years of captivity stretched on, Soviet prisoners developed elaborate collective memories of food, sharing recipes and farming techniques as a way to maintain connection with lives they had lived before the war. Men who had never cooked described their mother's dishes in painstaking detail. Farmers explained crop rotation and planting schedules to city dwellers who listened as if receiving sacred knowledge. These conversations about food and agriculture became acts of resistance, assertions that they still remembered a world where people grew things and ate them, where harvest meant survival rather than torture. The systematic starvation created permanent changes in survivors' relationships with food that would persist for decades after liberation. Men who endured years of hunger in German camps would spend the rest of their lives unable to waste even the smallest scrap of food, their bodies and minds permanently marked by the knowledge of what it meant to have nothing. They would grow gardens compulsively, plant vegetables in every available space, maintain food reserves that seemed excessive to those who had never known true hunger. The trauma of agricultural abandonment had rewired their basic instincts about security and survival. The spring of 1945 brought liberation to Soviet prisoners scattered across a collapsing German empire, but it also brought something none of them had prepared themselves to encounter. As Allied forces pushed deeper into German-held territory, Soviet prisoners found themselves transferred to American and British custody, moved from the camps where they had learned to expect death into facilities that operated under completely different assumptions about what captivity meant. The transition happened quickly, sometimes within days, giving prisoners no time to adjust mentally to the possibility that their circumstances might fundamentally change. The first indication that something was different came during the transport itself. Soviet prisoners being moved to Allied custody received rations for the journey, actual food rather than the near-starvation allotments they had grown accustomed to ignoring. American guards distributed canned goods, bread that was soft rather than moldy, even chocolate bars that seemed like artifacts from another lifetime. Some Soviet prisoners refused to eat, convinced the food was poisoned or that accepting it would obligate them in ways they could not afford. Others consumed everything immediately, their bodies so desperate for calories that caution seemed like a luxury they could not maintain. When the trucks pulled through the gates of American POW camps, Soviet prisoners emerged into a landscape that made no sense within their understanding of military detention. The first thing many noticed was not the barracks or the guard towers or the administrative buildings. It was the smell. Clean earth. Growing plants. The scent of farm animals and composted soil. Odors that belonged to agricultural life rather than imprisonment. Soviet veterans who had spent years in the antiseptic horror of German camps found themselves inhaling air that carried information their minds could barely process. Then they saw the gardens. Not small patches of contraband vegetables hidden in corners, but organized agricultural plots laid out in neat geometric patterns between the prisoner barracks. Rows of vegetables at various stages of growth. Bean plants climbing wooden trellises. Potato plants spreading healthy green leaves. Tomato vines heavy with developing fruit. The gardens were not decorative or symbolic. They were functional farming operations, maintained with obvious care and attention to proper horticultural technique. Soviet prisoners walked slowly through the American camp, their eyes moving constantly between impossible sights. A chicken coop built with proper ventilation and clean bedding, housing dozens of healthy birds that scattered at human approach. A rabbit hutch where animals bred specifically for meat production lived in conditions better than those Soviet prisoners had endured in German camps. A small dairy operation with 3 cows being milked by prisoners who wore clean work clothes and handled the animals with practiced efficiency. The cognitive dissonance was so severe that many Soviet prisoners simply stopped moving, standing frozen in pathways while they tried to reconcile what they were seeing with everything they had learned about captivity. The presence of livestock raised for food made no sense. The existence of vegetable gardens tended by prisoners contradicted fundamental assumptions about how captured soldiers were supposed to exist. The casual abundance of agricultural activity where men were supposed to be dying suggested they had entered some kind of elaborate theatrical production rather than a functioning military detention facility. American guards noticed the reactions of newly arrived Soviet prisoners and initially misinterpreted their stunned silence as fatigue or trauma from transport. It took several days before camp administrators began to understand that these men were not exhausted but fundamentally confused by the agricultural operations surrounding them. The Americans had built these farming systems as standard practice, following guidelines that assumed prisoners would need sustainable food sources and that agricultural work provided both nutrition and meaningful activity. To them, the farms were unremarkable, obvious applications of common sense to the practical challenges of housing large numbers of men. Soviet prisoners began asking careful questions, their inquiries filtered through interpreters who sometimes struggled to convey the depth of confusion behind seemingly simple words. They asked who had planted the gardens. The answer that prisoners themselves had done the planting under American supervision seemed impossible. They asked who would eat the vegetables. The response that prisoners would consume their own harvest violated every understanding they had developed about the relationship between labor and reward in captivity. One Soviet veteran, a former collective farm worker named Dmitry who had survived 3 years in German camps, spent an entire afternoon walking the perimeter of the American camp's main garden plot. He knelt periodically to examine soil quality, checking moisture levels and nutrient composition with the practiced touch of someone who understood agriculture at an intimate level. Other Soviet prisoners gathered to watch him, seeking some explanation for what they were witnessing. When Dmitry finally stood and spoke, his voice carried a tremor that had nothing to do with weakness. The soil had been amended. Someone had added organic matter, worked in compost, adjusted pH levels for optimal growing conditions. These were not gardens thrown together as propaganda displays. This was serious agriculture, implemented with knowledge and resources, maintained with the expectation of producing real yields that would actually feed people. Dmitry explained to his fellow prisoners that you could not fake this kind of farming. The plant health, the soil structure, the evidence of sustained care over multiple growing seasons, all of it pointed to agricultural operations that had been running successfully for months or years. Soviet prisoners discovered that the American camps operated on a system where different prisoner groups took responsibility for various aspects of food production. German prisoners who had agricultural backgrounds managed the vegetable gardens. Italian prisoners who had worked in food processing before the war supervised a small cannery operation where surplus harvest was preserved for winter consumption. Even prisoners with no farming experience were taught basic techniques and integrated into the agricultural workforce on the assumption that everyone could contribute to collective food security. The presence of tools designed specifically for agricultural work created another layer of disbelief. Soviet prisoners found storage sheds filled with proper gardening implements, hoes and rakes and shovels maintained in good condition and freely available for prisoner use. Seed supplies organized by variety and planting season. Fertilizers and soil amendments stored in quantities that suggested long-term planning rather than temporary measures. The infrastructure of food production had been deliberately built and was being actively maintained. American camp administrators held regular meetings where prisoners could request specific seeds or discuss agricultural challenges they were encountering in the gardens. Soviet observers who attended these sessions sat in stunned silence as German and Italian prisoners debated pest control strategies or argued about crop rotation schedules with American agricultural advisors who treated their input as valuable rather than irrelevant. The meetings operated under the assumption that prisoners were stakeholders in food production rather than merely recipients of whatever rations their captors chose to provide. The livestock operations proved even more difficult for Soviet prisoners to comprehend. American camps maintained small herds of animals specifically designated for prisoner consumption. The chickens laying eggs that would be distributed to prisoner mess halls. The rabbits being bred to provide supplemental protein. The dairy cows producing milk that prisoners could drink or use in cooking. Soviet veterans walked past these animals repeatedly, touching fence posts and gate latches as if to confirm the physical reality of what they were seeing. What disturbed them most was not the presence of the animals but the quality of care they received. The livestock lived in clean facilities, had access to adequate water and appropriate feed, received basic veterinary attention when needed. American guards explained that maintaining animal health was essential for sustainable food production, that sick or malnourished livestock would not produce reliable yields. This utilitarian logic made sense, but it also highlighted an uncomfortable truth. In American captivity, farm animals received better care than Soviet soldiers had experienced in German camps. Soviet prisoners began exploring every corner of the agricultural operations, driven by a need to understand the full scope of what they were witnessing. They discovered composting operations where food waste and organic materials were systematically processed into fertilizer for the gardens. Small greenhouses where seedlings were started in controlled conditions before being transplanted to outdoor plots. Root cellars designed for storing harvested vegetables through the winter months. Every element of the farming system had been thought through and implemented with attention to sustainability and long-term productivity. The irrigation systems revealed perhaps the most sophisticated planning. American engineers had designed water distribution networks that efficiently delivered moisture to garden plots, incorporating both overhead sprinklers and ground-level soaker systems depending on crop requirements. Soviet prisoners who had watched men die fighting over muddy water in German camps now observed vegetables receiving carefully measured irrigation on regular schedules determined by agricultural science rather than arbitrary cruelty. Some Soviet veterans sought out the prisoners who actually worked in the agricultural operations, hoping to understand how the system functioned from the inside. They found German and Italian prisoners who spoke with genuine enthusiasm about the gardens they tended, who took pride in successful harvests and debated strategies for improving yields. These prisoner farmers explained that they received slightly better rations as compensation for their agricultural labor, but more importantly, they valued the work itself as meaningful activity that produced visible results and contributed to collective welfare. The psychological adjustment required to accept that prisoners might voluntarily engage in food production, that they might care about agricultural success beyond mere survival, challenged Soviet understanding of human behavior under captivity. They had learned that prisoners did whatever was necessary to avoid death, that all actions were motivated by immediate self-preservation. The concept that captured soldiers might find satisfaction in growing food or take genuine interest in horticultural techniques seemed to belong to peacetime civilian life rather than military detention. American agricultural advisors occasionally walked through the gardens with prisoner work crews, offering guidance on technique or discussing seasonal planning. Soviet observers watched these interactions with intense focus, noting the absence of hostility or dominance and how American personnel related to enemy prisoners engaged in farming work. The advisors asked questions about plant health and listened to prisoner responses with apparent genuine interest. They made suggestions rather than issuing orders. They treated agricultural knowledge as valuable regardless of its source. The preserved food supplies revealed the full scope of American planning for long-term prisoner nutrition. Soviet prisoners discovered storage facilities holding canned vegetables from previous harvests, preserved meats from livestock operations, dried beans and grains purchased through official channels but supplemented by camp production. The Americans were not simply feeding prisoners day to day. They were maintaining food security systems designed to sustain large populations through multiple seasons regardless of external supply chain disruptions. Soviet veterans found themselves struggling with emotions they could barely name. The careful attention to prisoner nutrition, the systematic approach to food production, the assumption that captured enemies deserved access to adequate sustenance, all of it contradicted lessons learned through years of deliberate starvation. They had survived by accepting that they were meant to die slowly from hunger, that their suffering was intentional and permanent. Now they confronted evidence that other military powers had chosen completely different approaches to the fundamental question of how to feed captured soldiers. The presence of agricultural education programs added another dimension to Soviet confusion. American camps offered basic farming classes where prisoners with no previous agricultural experience could learn techniques that would serve them after the war. Classes covered topics like soil management, crop rotation, pest control, and basic animal husbandry. The instruction was practical and thorough, taught by American agricultural experts who seemed genuinely invested in their students' learning regardless of nationality or military affiliation. Soviet prisoners attended these classes in growing numbers, driven partly by hunger for knowledge but more fundamentally by a need to understand the philosophical framework that made such programs possible. They asked questions that went beyond farming technique to probe the underlying assumptions about prisoner treatment. Why teach agricultural skills to enemies? Why invest resources in education rather than simply providing minimal rations? Why assume that prisoners deserve to learn anything at all? The American instructors struggled to articulate answers that made sense to men whose experience had taught them opposite lessons. They spoke about international law requirements for prisoner welfare, about practical benefits of keeping captives productively occupied, about basic human dignity that persisted even in military contexts. But the real answer was simpler and more profound than any of these explanations. American military culture operated under assumptions that prisoners remained human beings deserving of basic consideration, that food security was a fundamental obligation rather than an optional courtesy, that agricultural knowledge represented value rather than threat. Soviet prisoners began participating in the actual farming work, initially motivated by extra rations but gradually becoming absorbed in the agricultural processes themselves. Men who had not touched growing plants in years found themselves weeding garden rows, harvesting vegetables, tending livestock with hands that remembered skills from lives lived before the war. The physical labor of agriculture provided more than just additional food. It offered a form of psychological healing, or reconnection with productive activity that countered years of forced passivity and helplessness. The seasonal cycles of planting and harvest created rhythms that stood in stark contrast to the timeless horror of starvation camps. Soviet prisoners found themselves tracking plant growth, anticipating harvest dates, planning for next season's crops with an investment in future time that they had not permitted themselves in German captivity. The act of planting seeds represented a radical assertion that there would be a future, that they would live to see growth and harvest, that agricultural cycles would continue to turn. The abundance of the American camp gardens during peak growing season created scenes that seemed almost obscene to men whose bodies still carried the physical evidence of years of starvation. Tables in prisoner mess halls piled with fresh vegetables. Salads made from produce picked that same morning. Fruit desserts prepared from camp orchards. The sheer quantity of food available overwhelmed Soviet prisoners who had trained themselves to expect nothing beyond survival-level rations. Some Soviet veterans found themselves unable to eat the abundant food at first, their bodies rebelling against sudden plenty after years of deprivation. Others consumed everything available with desperate intensity, their hunger too profound to be satisfied by any single meal or even weeks of adequate nutrition. American medical personnel worked carefully with newly liberated Soviet prisoners, understanding that the transition from starvation to sufficiency required as much medical oversight as the original malnutrition had demanded. The psychological healing that accompanied physical restoration proved complex and ongoing. Soviet prisoners gradually learned to trust that food would continue to be available, that the gardens would keep producing, that American commitment to prisoner nutrition was systematic rather than temporary. This restoration of food security represented more than just physical recovery. It marked the beginning of their reintegration into a world where agricultural abundance could exist even in military captivity, where growing food was considered essential rather than prohibited, where prisoners were fed rather than deliberately starved. The contrast with their German captivity became more painful as Soviet prisoners gained fuller understanding of what American agricultural systems represented. They realized that adequate food had always been possible, that farming operations could have sustained them through their years of suffering, that the starvation they had endured was a choice rather than an inevitability. The knowledge that simple agricultural interventions could have saved thousands of their comrades made the deaths seem even more tragic and unnecessary. Soviet prisoners who had agricultural backgrounds before the war found themselves valued for their expertise in American camps. Their knowledge of farming techniques was solicited and respected. They were consulted about crop selection and planting schedules. Their suggestions for improving yields were implemented and credited. After years of having their skills dismissed and their knowledge ignored, this recognition of their agricultural competence represented a restoration of dignity that extended beyond mere food provision. The documentation of agricultural production in American camps revealed systematic attention to detail that Soviet prisoners found both impressive and disturbing. Records tracked planting dates, harvest yields, food distribution, and nutritional outcomes with bureaucratic precision. This careful accounting demonstrated that prisoner nutrition was not left to chance or goodwill but was monitored and maintained as an official responsibility subject to oversight and improvement. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.